Hey guys, so today I'm talking about how CPTSD can ruin your relationships or your ability to have healthy relationships. And this sucks because you often get CPTSD because of relationships that should have been a place of comfort, that should have been a place of safety, but they weren't. So, for example, relationships with your parents, right? You expect your parents to love you, to have your back. And then if you had to deal with emotional neglect, or if you had to deal with parents with addictions or parents with narcissistic personality disorder, the treatment they gave you often creates complex PTSD, right? Which is post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's complex because it's not just one huge thing that happened, but it's consistent stress, consistent neglect, consistent things that were taking place over a long period of time where you didn't have help with them. So you wind up developing CPTSD, right? So it's a relationship wound that often creates it. And you crave relationships because we all do. That's how we're created. We're created to be connected, to have social interactions with each other. So we crave these interactions, and yet our own CPTSD, which is a relationship wound, winds up making it so hard. So I'm going to talk about three things that happen that your CPTSD can cause that creates problems in relationships. And then obviously in the end, we'll talk about how to overcome them. But first, I just want to say, if anyone is dealing with this and you just want to have normal, healthy relationships, and yet you continue to struggle with this, I just want to send you a huge hug because I have been there. I know what it's like. I know how painful it is. I know how lonely it can be when you're trying to just make these connections and your own nervous system is preventing you. Or I also know what it's like to experience the pain of looking back and being like, why did I do that? Why did I say that? Why am I acting like that? Like, that is not me. And yet the CPTSD causes you to act, think, talk in ways that is so contrary to who you are. So I just want you to know that I've been there. I know how hard it is. So hang in there. It does get better, but let's talk about three things that happen. The first thing is with emotional triggers. Now, emotional triggers, they can be anything. Sometimes we might think that an emotional trigger is something that happens because of something bad somebody does. No. And you can be triggered by anything because the nervous system, when you're going through something that is really taxing your nervous system, it will join together things that don't often make sense. So, for example, something that I shared in my other channel that really focused on narcissistic abuse, but something that I shared was how oftentimes the car can be a place that can be very triggering. If you're with somebody in your life that was abusive and they always consistently abused you in the same place or doing the same things, visiting the same areas, then your nervous system has those things memorized. And so what can happen, let's say you're triggered in the car, because oftentimes with abusive people, they love to fight in the car because you can't go anywhere. So fast forward, you're out of the relationship and now you're in a relationship with somebody else and you're in a car. A couple of things can happen because of that trigger. If that trigger is left unhealed, then what will happen is you'll be in the same situations that caused the emotional pain in the first place, and you will respond from your trauma response. So your trauma response might be fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So let's say you're in the car with somebody completely different, a healthy person, but you're now in the car and you're feeling, because this is what happens with an emotional trigger, the feelings that are associated with the trauma from the past come up in the present. And if you don't understand that this is happening, you can accidentally take your trigger out on an innocent party. So they might say something and you're feeling all this discomfort in your body because of the trigger. And if your trauma response is fight, you might find yourself really snapping or being really aggressive with that person, not because you want to fight, but because your nervous system is remembering the trauma. It's activating the unhealed wound that's on the inside, the unhealed belief, the unhealed emotions, or I should say the unprocessed emotions that are attached to the past in this event. And it's all coming up. And if you don't realize that, then you can think that the person in the car with you is the one that's activating the discomfort in your body. So you could start a fight. You can flee in the sense you might just suddenly want to be away from this person, thinking again that it's them. Or you can shut down. You can freeze, dissociate, or fawn, go into major people pleasing. So at that moment, you stop being you and your survival kicks on. Unhealed trauma can often cause you to be taking out on an innocent party things that are unhealed from the past. Nowhere is this more clear than in a relationship. That can really come up in a relationship. And with my coaching clients, a lot of them say, this is coming up in my relationship. How can I get the other party to understand that they're triggering me? So if that's something you've asked, make sure you watch to the end where we're going to talk about what to do about it. The second thing that can happen if you have unhealed trauma, if you're working through CPTSD from the past, is that you have to understand a lot of people that have complex PTSD, it's because of relationships that should have been different. It should have been a loving, safe environment. If it's a spouse, if it's a parent, if it's a family member, right? But it wasn't. So what happens is when you're in those dynamics for a long time, let's say it's a parent that was emotionally unavailable or emotionally immature or with a personality disorder, and they treated you in ways that made you feel bad about yourself, to the point that what children will do is they will really focus on trying to make the other person happy, right? So they become extremely externally focused. And in doing so, they lose connection to self. So in order to have a connection to self in childhood, we needed to be mirrored properly. How our parents saw us and treated us becomes how we see ourselves and treat ourselves. So without that, it's almost like we don't have a relationship with self, and we stay stuck in that childhood strategy of trying to please the other person. So you go a long period of time in life craving external validation. You go a long period of time in life being disconnected from self, not even having you. So there's a difference between being lonely and toxic loneliness, where I feel toxic loneliness comes from the fact that we just didn't have ourselves, right? We were completely unaware of anything that was going on the inside, and we were so externally focused. So if that's the case, then sometimes there's such a thirst for connection, right? So let's say you leave all toxic family members, you leave all toxic relationships. So now you don't have the toxic relationship, but you still don't have you. So there is an extreme loneliness and extreme thirst. And the way that can show up and ruin relationships when it's unhealed is that you can wind up really just kind of dumping and pouring yourself out to somebody that barely knows you. And for toxic people love when you do this, because they're like filing everything away. Oh, this is this person's deepest wounds. Wow, this person's been through that. This is what they're feeling. They get all kinds of information that allow them to pull you into another toxic relationship. So toxic people love that, but healthy people don't. When someone is like pouring out everything about themselves in such a way, it's almost like it's an overload. It's like a brain dump, an emotional dump of everything that's inside of them. That's not healthy, because healthy relationships, they build trust with time. And so when we're not healed and we have such a thirst, it's like, it's hard to control that. Because think about it. If you are hydrated and you go over someone's house and you see a glass of water, right, that's on the counter, you're just going to be like, oh, that's nice. It's not going to do anything to you. But imagine if you've been walking through the desert and now you're at somebody's house and there's water there, you're going to run over. You're not going to be yourself. You're going to be craving that water in an out of control way. Well, just like you would have that thirst if you were walking through a desert, when you're walking through an emotional desert, you can have that extreme thirst as well. And it just causes people to kind of pull away, because healthy relationships, they start and they build. They don't dump everything and then work backwards. And the last thing that I'm going to mention, it's not an all-inclusive list, but this is something that's really hard if you still have unhealed CPTSD and how it gets in the way of relationships, is the fact that oftentimes if you had a narcissistic parent, in this case, we'll focus on personality disordered cluster B parents or family members. If you had that in your life, then you were never allowed to have your own opinion and your own perspective. So because you were never allowed to have it, again, it wasn't mirrored to you that you were allowed to have a different thought than someone else. So because it wasn't mirrored to you, you don't know how to do that with yourself, and you may not know how to do it with other people. And so if two people see things differently, it's almost like this triggers you into over explaining. It creates this extreme discomfort if somebody else doesn't see things exactly how you see them. Instead of being able to be like, oh, okay, well, you know what? You're allowed to see that way. I see it this way, but that's okay. It's almost like you can't do that. It creates so much discomfort inside of you. And so when that's the case, that's really hard to form close relationships with people that are healthy, because no one sees things exactly how someone else does. We might have a lot in common, but there are going to be differences, and that's normal and that's okay. And so in the beginning, it can be really uncomfortable, and it can cause unnecessary disagreements where the other person is kind of made to feel like they have to agree with you or there's a problem. And so that causes division, and that causes people to feel uncomfortable around that. So those are just 3 things that I wanted to mention, how CPTSD comes from relationship problems, but then causes relationship problems if we don't heal it. Now, it might be there because of someone else, right? Some other toxic person in your life could have created it. Regardless, at some point, we have to shift into, okay, this is happening to me. This is my experience, and this is how it's affecting my relationships now. I need to do something, right? I need to work on me. And so some things that can help, just to kind of give you some tips. So when it comes to triggers, sometimes what's up with my microphone? Sometimes, hope that's better. Okay. Sometimes the tendency is to try to get the person to stop triggering. I'm going to tell them and they're going to stop and they're going to change so that I'm not triggered. The problem with that is the trigger stays in the body. Triggers don't go away with time. They stay in the body and they find ways to come up. So for example, let's say being in the car was something that was a trigger. And let's say it was because in the car, you got the silent treatment a lot, right? So being drastic here, let's say you're never in the car with the person you're in a relationship with, whether it's a friend or a new relationship, and you meet places all the time. Well, maybe the car won't trigger you, but maybe if the person is just in their own space, if they're just kind of a little quiet that day, then yes, it was in the car, but it was the silent treatment, and your nervous system will find a piece of it that's familiar in your life at the moment to give it the opportunity to come up, because the purpose of it coming up is that your nervous system wants to heal it. So rather than avoiding triggers, you really want to find ways to work through the trigger, to work through the beliefs that are being touched on when you are triggered. So in other words, what we resist persists. And so it's best to learn how to go through a trigger instead of trying to keep burying it. When it comes to oversharing and over-explaining, Remember, if we are hydrated with water, we are not going to like go out of control if we see somebody else with a glass of water. So we need to start emotionally hydrating ourselves. We need to start learning what it's like to be there for ourselves. Not saying that you can't have relationships or that you shouldn't have relationships, but saying that you should also have a relationship with you that is healthy. When you are taking care of your emotional needs and you have a healthy connection to self, then that desire to just put it all out there can at least start to calm down a little bit. And the last one, when working on differences, it's just about practice. So if you had narcissistic family members, they teach you to think a certain way just because you've been around them for a long time. They call it narcissistic fleas, right? Two dogs stand next to each other. One has fleas, one doesn't. Guess what? They both leave with fleas. So if you were around people with narcissistic traits, then there are some fleas that you get. And one of those fleas can be the expectation that everyone has to have the same thought, or the discomfort when somebody disagrees with you. So starting to practice giving people permission and giving yourself permission to have your own thoughts, your own perspectives, to allow differences starts to strengthen the ability to feel comfortable in those differences. So I hope these tips help. If you're struggling, if you've been learning about trauma, you've been learning about complex PTSD, narcissistic abuse for a long time, and you still feel stuck, make sure you check out Thriver School of Transformation. We got a lot of awesome things happening for 2023. We have 9 to 12 live meetings. We have EFT, trauma release breathwork. We have coaching sessions, and we're going to start doing what's known as Psych-K sessions, which is a modality that uses whole brain states to upgrade subconscious beliefs. So I'm super excited to be adding that to our membership. There's a 7-day free trial so you can taste it, see if you like it, and see if it's a good fit for your recovery journey.